Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series by the Havas Medical Anthropology team. We're here to take the BS out of behavioral science by illuminating the why behind the what's of behaviors, rituals, and symbols that people take for granted. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires.
Now, today we're not really talking about rituals and symbols, but we are talking about or with someone for whom rituals, symbols, all those things get processed a little bit differently. So first of all, welcome, Catherine Parsons. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here. So Catherine, just a little backstory. Catherine has autism. She works with us at Havas, and she has been recognized for outstanding leadership in technology in 2023. She's one of the top inspiring women shaping search engine optimization on International Women's Day in 2022. Catherine's got 25 years worth of digital marketing experience with leadership positions with Office Depot, Philip Morris International, Mach 9 Digital. She was born non-speaking, we're all born non-speaking, but through her developmental milestone, she was nonverbal. We talked about that quite a bit, and was diagnosed with autism. And she joined Havas, not just to bring her digital expertise, but to expand our efforts to bring neurodiversity, both in the workplace and to our clients. So first of all, super excited to have you on. I have enjoyed speaking with you so much about all of these things. So we originally started this conversation talking about taboos and shame and how they don't really resonate with you or with neurodivergent people in general. I don't want to make gross claims about every neurodivergent person everywhere, but the idea that people sort of view these things differently, or often, in my case, I'll see something that other people will find upsetting and I'll think, I don't find it upsetting. I want to ask them why they're doing it, you know? And so we've had a lot of conversations about the programming you do to better interact, your own personal programming. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just what do you mean by programming, and what do you mean by this metacognitive effort to understand how taboos work, for example?
Okay, so first off, I don't recognize hierarchies. To me, everybody is singular. I even look at color from a singular standpoint. Every color is unique to me, because when I see color in someone's shirt, I might notice the differences in how the wool absorbed the blue dye in your outfit. And I see detail at a level that is very distracting at times. Like when I'm talking to someone, I don't look them in the eye because I notice the color changes in their iris and their blood.
Now, you and I had this conversation. So you said that to me, and I said, that's interesting, because we've been talking for 10 minutes and you're looking me right in the eyes and you said, no, I'm not. I'm looking at the bridge of your nose.
That was one of the basic things I had to learn when I was first getting started in the workplace, because I found that people didn't like it if I didn't make eye contact, or what they considered eye contact. So I learned a trick. I looked at a stationary point in between your eyes, the bridge of the nose, in order to simulate eye contact. And if you think about like the different ways I sort of trick normalcy or give myself the appearance of being normal, like for example, when I meet people, I have they're out of focus for me, because I basically have a form of facial blindness. And so until I learned them, they slowly start to come into focus for me. And what that means is that I might need several interactions before I know who they are. But on the same token, they can be hurt. Their feelings can get hurt if they run into me a second, third, or fourth time and I don't know who they are. So I started giving different names to different people based on the setting that I was originally in when I met them and the interactions I expected to have in the future with them. For example, if I meet you at work, I might say, hey, I'm Catherine. And Catherine comes with formal language and formal behaviors in the workplace. If I met you a happy hour, I might tell you, hi, my name is Kat, because Kat is my business casual. And I know that I can have casual conversations, talk about my love for some of my special interests like American football as well as K-pop. And then if you are somebody who I am personal friends with, that are friends or family, I might say, I'm Katie. And when I tell you that my name is Katie, I'm signaling that it's okay for me to show all my little autistic quirks when I'm hanging out with you. And so when you walk up and you say, hi, Catherine, I know I'm in a business setting. And that really helped me a lot because of my lack of understanding of hierarchy and what's expected when I meet someone, like that lack of intent. Having that signal, my name, tell me how I should be behaving was really, really important for functioning in the workplace.
One of the things we talked about for this episode was really trying to help people understand both, get some insight into what we mean by neurodiversity. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. There was a guy named Jesse Saperstein who has autism, and Jesse was fairly successful in life. He's a funny guy. But he also talked about some of his social mishaps. Jesse said one of his problems was too much pattern recognition, that something that worked in one setting, he would try in every setting. So for example, getting a date to go to the prom in high school, he simply asked every girl in his high school until someone said yes, which everybody knew him. It was a small town. When he got to college and tried the same thing, he immediately became known as Jesse the Creep. I mean, he didn't really understand the difference between asking everyone in a town where you grew up versus asking a whole bunch of strangers at college where no one knows you. So for him, it was over application of patterns. Is that a standard?
That happens with me in facial expressions, like my natural state. I'm blank face and I don't send any signal to the other person. And so when I am trying to have a conversation with someone, rather than show you what I'm feeling, I'm showing you my intent, the emotion that I think is associated with the piece of conversation that I'm having with you. So like if right now I'm trying to show you that I'm warm and friendly, so I am trying to change patterns in my voice. I am trying to use smile. I'm trying to use different pauses or nodding to show that I'm engaged with you. And all of that doesn't come on automatic. I'm not doing this automatically using the clutch, in the car. And I'm shifting manually in order to have a conversation. And so what happens
for you millennials, a clutch is an ancient device in a car that has shifters.
So what happens is that I have moments where my emoting gets out of whack. This happened the other day when we were talking and you used a metaphor where I stopped emoting because I didn't know what signal I was supposed to be sending you. You picked up on it.
I'm a discourse analyst, so this is what I heard, right? I'll put it in my words, that a lot of the mirroring you were doing was based on what you needed to do to make people you were talking to comfortable. It wasn't something that you needed to do. It was something you needed to do to have a successful conversation. And when I used a metaphor like that, you kind of missed a beat. And I could see it. And I said, that didn't work for you, did it? And you said, I don't do metaphors. It turns out you actually understood exactly what I meant. But that whole like adding curtains to the window, meaning there's a sort of practical amount of information that I want to convey with you. But because I recognize that as a person, you also want extra information in there. You want me to smile at the right time. You want me to nod at the right time. You want me to meet your eye at the right time.
Yeah, I have to consciously do that. And because what happens is when I don't send you a signal, a lot of people, that's where the creep factor comes in. Because they're not getting a signal. They have nothing nonverbal to latch onto. And then they start imprinting emotions I don't want imprinted. Like they might think I'm apathetic. I don't care.
Right.
They might think that I'm bored, that I'm angry. Whatever negative emotion you want to come up with, they'll imprint on me, even if I've given them no indication in my language patterns based on word usage and words in proximity of each other, or, the lack of signal. They're just going to assume that what I'm doing is negative. And so I learned early on, I had to send a signal even if that signal didn't naturally create on its own, in order to smooth things over.
And it was so interesting for me when you were telling this story. And it just, what struck me is we had this conversation about cancer and labeling people heroes before, and running into this idea of people maybe projecting their emotions, projecting their insecurities. They send signals out into the world, we all do, and they expect something in return. And when that's not returned in a way that they expect, whether it's thank you for calling me a hero, or when I talk to someone who's neurodivergent and they aren't reacting in a way that I was looking for, there seems to be a disconnect, and somehow blame is always shifted to the other thing that didn't work the way I wanted it to go.
Oftentimes people's negative feelings about somebody like me who's autistic, it's based on their own insecurities. Like, they're afraid, am I boring you? Because you're not sending me a signal. So that means you're giving me a poker face. That means you don't like me. And you're trying to hide that you don't like me. And like, they go into these thought spirals. And I'm like, dude, I was tired that day.
Yeah.
Right. Thinking about you. I had no thoughts about you whatsoever. But yet you walked away from that interaction with a very negative impression. Or sometimes I get what's called limerence, where I get a special attraction because of something somebody did or said that makes me think they're interesting. And I focus. And this is the thing, when I focus and I'm not paying attention to the fact that I am focusing on someone, it can feel very intense, because now I'm sending you a lot of signals.
Right.
And that's where that creepy factor comes in, where they're like, oh, you're giving me way too much attention. This is making me uncomfortable.
Yeah, you're love bombing me, as they say, right? Like So there's a couple things that we've touched on that's sort of interesting that we've never talked about on the podcast that's near and dear to my heart as a linguist. One of them is there is a psychological or a social element to conversation, communication, talking, speech, language. What I'm very interested in is language as a social habit. And so there's a couple of things I want to point out that we've proven experimentally. One is, if you don't give people feedback for their contributions, they start to wonder if anybody even heard them, right? So there's a psychological experiment they'll do. They'll disconnect the light from an elevator button. And what happens when you push an elevator button is a light comes on, and that reassures you that the elevator has been called. If you don't get that light, you don't know if the elevator is coming, and you will find people poking the button over and over and over again, hoping for a different reaction. And in conversation, that's, again, it's a metaphor, but that's sort of not unlike what happens when people say something and they get literally no response. And so one of the things people are doing continuously in many conversations is called back channeling. So as I talk, you nod, then I know that you heard what I said and I can keep going. It's a nonverbal response, but nodding at the right times, or saying, or saying like, oh yeah, I get you. Like, all of those things, they really don't carry any information other than I am still with you in this conversation. And we do it a lot. And it's one of the things that's culturally mediated, how much back channeling you do. It's called back channeling. How much back channeling you do, what nature it takes. Is it verbal? Is it physical? Is it gestures? Is it your face? And those are things that people just learn through the culture they grow up in. But if you don't learn that, you have to teach yourself.
Absolutely. And one thing to understand about someone like me who's on the spectrum, we may not have the mechanism that intuitively tells us when to nod or when to give that signal. So we have two choices. We either have to pretend, and by the way, that can backfire. Sometimes when I am trying to emote and trying to back channel for them, they think I'm being sarcastic, or they think I'm being passive aggressive, because they pick up on the fact that I'm not really naturally doing this. I'm acting. So they look at that as a lack of authenticity, as I'm being false with them. I'm lying. And so they say, were you making fun of me? Because your facial expressions were over exaggerated.
That's a great idea, right? The sarcasm stuff. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's a form of communication that is simply ritual, that is about like we are connected. I recognize you, you recognize me. Morning greetings are a good way of doing it, right? So you walk by somebody, you go, Gabe, and Gabe goes, morning, Brad. That there's no real information being exchanged other than we are in a relationship and we recognize each other. And you know you're in those situations when people start filling in the blank with wrong stuff, but it still does the work. So for example, you give a cashier some money and they say, thank you, have a nice day. And you say, you too. Okay, that works. But sometimes they'll say, great. And you go, you too. That's not the right answer to great, right? And it happens all the time. We do it all the time. And you'll sort of catch yourself. The reason you did it was utterly formulaic in the first place. It's just a ritual greeting, or it's just a ritual, in this case, like the end of a commercial transaction. We're simply acknowledging that we've had a sort of mini interaction, a mini relationship, and it's over. It was never about conveying information, sort of formal, semantic, truth functional information.
That whole ritual piece,
yeah,
is totally lost on me. Like, I actually have to remind myself to greet people or to say goodbye. I used to have this habit when I was younger, and it took me a little bit to train myself out of this habit. When I was done conveying information, I would immediately walk away. I had to work on my transitions in conversation to let somebody know that I was going to be exiting the conversation. Because to me, it's like, okay, I've told you all the information you need in order to go to the next step. Goodbye, click. And that abruptness would bother people.
Once you understand how that works, you can manipulate that as a non-neurodivergent person. And I'm putting that in big air quotes because we haven't really defined neurodivergence. But let's say you want to interrogate someone. If you want to make them uncomfortable, you withhold some of that ritual communication. You make it clear that you're not here for fun and games, that you are here to get information. And that can be very disconcerting to people. A bad performance review, how it starts really tells you what to expect. If you walk in and go, hey, how's everything going? And they go, sit down. That is a lot of information, even though it's only an answer, because you know that someone just said to you, whatever pleasant preamble to a conversation we're going to have, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to get straight to the meat of the conversation. We do this stuff without thinking about it a lot. Humans do. And we also do it in a very cultural way. So, for example, do you say hello every time you pass someone in the hall? I think in some ways, when I talk to you about your language processing, Catherine, you are aware of some of the micro processes that I normally think only people who study language, people who do interrogations, linguists, those sorts of things, they're interviewers, professional interviewers, they're the ones who are aware of these patterns. Most people aren't. It was fascinating for me to hear you describe things that I took years to study and learn, and you're like, you did too. You, as a child, you had to study them and learn them.
Because keep in mind, the first 3 years of my life, I didn't say a word, absolutely nothing. In fact, my parents were very concerned. They took me to get testing, and I was non-responsive in early childhood testing because I was trying to filter and figure out how to interact in my world, in a world that was so overwhelming for me. And then when I started speaking, and I was kind of forced into it by my parents. I didn't want to. Actually, when I use my voice, it echoes in my head, and that echo is actually painful because sound is painful for me. So it took a lot to convince me to use my words. And then when I started using my words, I realized every time I use my words, I'm not getting the response that I intended. And so then I had to start mapping behaviors to understand, why am I getting these responses? Why are other people getting different responses when they use the same words? What are they doing differently? And it was a lot of experimentation. And part of the reason why I'm a better communicator now than I was, say, 20 years ago when I first started working is because I've had 20 years of testing and learning along the way.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. Quite frankly, it is. This is why you'll see autistics oftentimes prefer hybrid or remote environments, because being in the office requires a lot more when we have to socially interact with other people. I mean, and there are times I have my downtime where I have to literally block out the universe to get some peace. So some people, they find being alone lonely. I find being alone a relief. It's almost like, let's get some quiet here.
I saw a thing, we talked about this. So I saw a thing where there's quiet reading clubs where people who are exhausted but don't want to be alone can go to a cafe on a certain night, and that's the quiet reading night, and everybody talks for 5 minutes, and then they just get a book and they read together in a room, but not interacting. And that is a real social event that people look forward to because they don't have the burden of interaction, but they do have the joy of human company. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. Like my kids will come downstairs and sit next to me and say absolutely nothing to me. And we might sit in the room and for hours on end say nothing to each other. And to us, it's harmony, that quietness.
Yeah.
But for other people who are walking into this environment, because you're walking into the house where now our differences are the majority, like people get a little weirded out. They're like, okay, you're all sitting there, you're all perfectly happy, you're not saying one word to each other, yet you seem, like I said, that there's joy. It's like, and also how I express joy may not be socially acceptable. Like I was taught early on not to express joy because when I am happy, I vibrate head to toe. The best way to describe it is I was at a K-pop concert once, waiting in line to go to the bathroom, and I was vibrating because I was really enjoying the music. And the person thought I just had to really go, and they were going to let me like cut ahead. And I'm like, no, I don't have to go. I do have to go to the bathroom. I said, but that's not the reason why I'm vibrating. I'm vibrating because it's my autistic joy.
I think Catherine has a lot of insight into why it's important to keep these things in mind when we create ads for audiences. Neurodivergence is something it's sort of a new term, but not a new idea. The frame used to be there's normal people and broken people, essentially. And we don't do that anymore because we don't think of things as being black and white, yes and no. Things are on a scale, and you can be more or less on certain different scales. And that leads to what are people capable of? And so I want to talk about the Assume I Can ad with the woman who has Down syndrome, who says, bartender, you assume I don't want to drink, so you don't give it to me, right? That won a gold at Cannes. Do you want to speak to that a little bit about why you thought that was such a powerful ad and really what resonated with you?
So I have those lived experiences of having people treat me less than capable. My parents were terrified of what would happen when I lived on my own. They didn't think I would be capable. They didn't think I was capable of having a relationship. I mean, all my dates in high school were chaperoned because they were concerned that I wouldn't know what to do in certain social situations. Because, backtracking, I don't have a sense of danger when I'm in a situation that could be dangerous. I can't tell intent from other people based on nonverbal cues like facial expressions or body language. If somebody is threatening me, I may not recognize it as a threat until they actually get physical. So they had a lot of concerns, and unfortunately they look at us as childlike because of how we interact with the world. We're very curious. So there was this feeling of, how is this child going to be out here and interacting with the big bad world? And the thing is that if you don't give us opportunities to experience the world, we might stay in that infantile state.
Right.
And that was the piece of the ad that just really hit me hard, because if I had lived my life according to my parents, I would have never left the couch.
Right.
I would have been taken care of my whole life. I would have transitioned into an adult and been in managed services.
Right.
And I would have never been on my own because, I was that child who slept in the closet to hide from the colors of her room. I was the child that they had to perform CPR on me several times because once I figured out that water could mute sound after a near drowning, I started throwing myself into large bodies of water.
You said that when we first met, and that really has struck me. And you said something that really struck me, which is that drowning is a very common cause of death for young autistic children. And you said they're trying to mute the sounds. They're trying to get away from all this sensory input. And I have been thinking about that since we talked. I have limited interaction with, having deep conversations with people who identify as autistic. So I'm focusing on the idea of like, how is this autistic person talking to me? And Jesse Saperstein was the other one who I saw a lot of. He came a couple different times to talk and stuff. And he would have one of those paddle balls,
Yeah.
the paddle that you tap. And he would, when he was talking, if it was a large enough group, he would just pull out his paddle ball and start paddle balling, because that was calming to him. And as soon as you got used to that and tolerant of that, you could have a great conversation with Jesse. But if you didn't like somebody paddle balling in front of you, you would not have a conversation. Anyway, the point is, I think coping mechanisms are something that make it possible to live in the big bad world, as you called it. But if you deny people the opportunity to learn what their coping mechanisms are, they're never going to succeed.
Yeah. I mean, like right now while we're talking, I'm wearing my fuzzy slippers and I scrunch my toes. And so if I start feeling uncomfortable, I will, what's called stimming, I will scrunch out of the screen so you don't see the paddle balling. But believe me, I do the same thing too. And it's a way of self-soothing. I also, when I go to busy restaurants or busy environments, and for me, being in a busy environment has a lot of anxiety around it, because I have severe auditory processing challenges where if I get overwhelmed by too much stimulus, I may lose the ability to understand language, and I may lose my words because my natural state is non-speaking. So what will happen is that if I'm in a busy place, I'll have Pokemon Go on my phone and I'll be staring at the screen and focused on that screen. And I will be just talking to the screen instead of talking to the person, because I'm trying to minimize environmental stimuli. But to a lot of people who wait staff, sometimes they get a little upset because they think that's rude. And it is rude, to be honest. I mean, people want your attention, but sometimes I have to focus on something else in order to have a conversation so that I can help filter.
I think the idea that low expectations are met is something that's very powerful in the ad, Hey Bartender. And I was saying to Gabe, I think one of the reasons why it's so powerful is whoever you are, somebody somewhere has thought you weren't good enough to do something that you thought you were, whether it's your whole life or whether it's just like, no, you can't.
I mean, that's the thing about it. The insight seems to be universal. There doesn't seem to be like, we're going to target people with Down syndrome. And like, that's where it starts. And we're going to speak to that. But I think what's so powerful about the assume that I can spot is that it speaks to everybody in a certain way, and in a way that you can relate to people with Down syndrome. But you can also look at your own life and say, like, there are times where people didn't think I could do something, and then I didn't, or then I persevered and I showed them that I could do something. So that really stuck out to me, because Catherine, when the impetus for that conversation was really like, advertising in general doesn't really resonate with you, it doesn't really strike you. So it was interesting to hear that this one struck you and how it struck you.
Yeah, it's because if I can't map it back to a lived experience, I can't relate to it. It has to be something in my past or my history that I have experienced to say, because my emotional state is deregulated. I may not know what I'm feeling, but I can pull up a memory very quickly of something that I felt a year ago or 6 months ago or a week ago. And if I can understand what that feeling was, then I can react.
That gets to the heart of good advertising, right? And that's where I'm saying it's more of and spectrum is not a word I'm introducing, but this idea that there's a spectrum of comfort. We all have certain elements of social anxiety, for example. We all have certain elements of misunderstanding communication. I certainly do. And so I think the idea that there are people who we anticipate won't be able to do a job, so we don't give it to them. The other part is the quote authenticity of the ad. Right? Authenticity to me means, can you identify with that? I don't have to be a person with Down syndrome to identify with the idea that people are saying you can't do it.
Right. Well, it's like when I was younger, I got told that I couldn't be a people manager because I'm autistic, and autistic people are socially awkward and not good with people. Or, I got told I couldn't be a public speaker because I was born non-speaking and I was in speech therapy until I was 10 years old. And so getting up on stage would be a problem. I think a lot of what caused me to choose to do things was that impetus of being told that I couldn't do it and I wanted to prove them wrong. So I think some of it also, you get that fire. I don't know how you guys feel, but when somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm like, oh no, now I really want to do it. Originally, I wanted to be a speechwriter when I started college because I wasn't comfortable getting on stage. But it wasn't until somebody told me I couldn't get on stage that I said, you know what, I want to be on stage now.
See, this is why we get along, Catherine. I'm a bit of a contrarian too. So Gabe is laughing now. But again, I think there's this idea that somehow we need to craft campaigns that are different for people in different corners of, say, a cognitive spectrum or, that on the autism spectrum. And I think the Hey Bartender ad shows you good storytelling resonates for anyone. I use the example all the time. You don't have to be a 15 or 16-year-old German Jewish girl living in a tower to be able to identify with Anne Frank. That is a story that has some universal power. And that part, I think, a good story well told should resonate. You should be able to identify with kings and peasants because the universal human experience of being understood or misunderstood or looking for purpose or meaning. I will say to our advertising community, when we start thinking about people not as, well, there's this group and there's this group and there's this group, but there's a sort of, what's the universal thread that we're trying to activate here? Then you start creating ads that can resonate both with the target audience and well beyond it. And that
Right.
part I find very inspiring when we do ads like that.
Well, and I think what I would challenge people to do, if you have a campaign and you have 5 variants, one of those variants should be targeting neurodiversity, because up to 20% of your audience has some type of diverse thinking, diverse difference, diverse challenge. And the way they interact with your brand, you might need to use more cognitive accessibility, where using direct language instead of using metaphors for that particular variant. Because like we talked about before, idioms, metaphors, all of that, I have to really think about it. And if you make me think, it's not going to create that same connection than if I experience something I lived when I'm watching that ad.
And that stat is just so important. It sticks out to me so much. 1 in 5 are neurodiverse. And based on some of the stats that Catherine shared with us, that number isn't going to go down. It's not going to go to 1 in 6. It's probably going to go to 1 in 4, 1 in 3. In March 2024, Forbes reported that 22% of Gen Z identify as definitely neurodiverse, 31%, almost 1 in 3, identify as somewhat neurodiverse. So this is something that we need to be paying attention to as far as when we talk to these audiences, and that there is diverse thinking, like Catherine was saying, and it's not something that's completely out there and separate. There's a loss of audience that we have when we're not doing this, I guess is the better way to say it. So as we get closer to time, Catherine, we like to give our guests the final word. So is there anything that we haven't mentioned, anything you want to bring up, anything you'd like to revisit just as a final point to close us out?
I would just say be open to different perspectives and be more mindful that there are different ways of looking at a brand or different ways of experiencing a brand. And so when you are trying to come up with that message, and you're trying to think of those variants, think about how these different people might look at that message and might live with that message. And the more you can do to make it something that I live rather than I have to think about to connect to, the more I'll resonate with the message you're trying to give me. Because the more I have to think, that's where that pause happens. That's where I think about it. And when I start thinking about it, it becomes a lot harder for me to connect to it.
That's interesting. Well, this has been, Catherine, just a tremendous pleasure. It's a second in-depth conversation we've had. I learn something every time. So I hope you listening at home or in your car, or wherever you listen, got as much out of it as we did. But for Catherine Parsons and myself, Brad Davidson, and Gabrielle Cummings, this is Breaking the Code. Thanks for joining us. Yeah,
thanks for listening, everyone. And thanks, Catherine, for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created by the Havas Medical Anthropology Group. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabrielle Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.